Translate that now. The command cut through the candlelit room like a blade wrapped in silk, sharp enough to silence even the quiet clink of crystal against crystal, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell, the man who built a billion-dollar empire from nothing but instinct and control, felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, because no one moved, not his assistant, not his CFO, not the legal team seated just inches away. And across the polished walnut table, the international investors exchanged glances, their voices continuing in rapid, fluid Mandarin that flowed like water over stone, elegant, precise, and completely beyond his grasp. And just like that, the room he owned slipped half an inch out of his control, which was all it took to feel like everything. The skyline of San Francisco stretched behind them in glittering defiance, a sea of glass towers and ambition, the kind of view that usually reminded Ethan exactly who he was, a man who didn't lose, a man who dictated outcomes. But tonight the city lights blurred slightly, not from weakness, but from the simple, brutal truth that power meant nothing if you couldn't understand the words being spoken in your own negotiation. He leaned forward, jaw tight, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, nodding as if he understood, as if he was still in command. But the rhythm was off now, the timing wrong, his responses delayed by seconds that felt like miles. And in a room where timing was everything, that hesitation was louder than any mistake. Around him, tailored suits shifted subtly, cufflinks catching the warm amber light, the scent of aged bourbon and truffle oil hanging in the air like a reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just dinner. This was a $1 billion deal balanced on tone, nuance, and trust. And right now, Ethan was missing all three. "We should clarify," one of the investors said in accented English, polite but edged, and Ethan nodded again, too quickly this time. The kind of nod that didn't confirm understanding but exposed the lack of it. And somewhere behind him, a chair scraped softly, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to someone watching closely, it was the sound of tension cracking. Naomi Brooks had been moving through the room all night like a shadow stitched into the fabric of service, refilling glasses, adjusting plates. Her presence acknowledged only in passing, if at all, but her eyes missed nothing. Not the way Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table before stilling. Not the slight shift in the investor's posture as confidence turned into caution. Not the exact moment when control quietly slipped from the man who was supposed to command it. And she understood something no one else in that room seemed to notice yet. This deal wasn't collapsing loudly. It was unraveling in silence. Ethan cleared his throat, straightened his jacket, and spoke again, this time choosing words carefully, too carefully. "Of course, we agree with the proposed structure," he said, voice steady, measured, the voice of a man who had closed deals twice this size without breaking a sweat. But the moment the words left his mouth, the reaction across the table changed, subtle, but unmistakable. A flicker of confusion, a glance exchanged, a tightening of lips, and that was when the first real crack appeared, because what he thought they said wasn't what they said at all. And in that single misunderstanding, $1 billion began to slip through his fingers without a sound. The silence did not break. It thickened, stretching across the table like something invisible yet impossible to ignore, and Ethan felt it in the way no one immediately responded. In the way the lead investor leaned back ever so slightly, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing not in anger but in calculation, as if reassessing everything he thought he understood about the man sitting across from him. And that was the moment Ethan realized he had said the wrong thing. Not obviously wrong, not enough to cause a scene, but wrong in a way that shifted leverage. And in a negotiation of this size, leverage was everything. He forced a quiet chuckle, the kind that usually smoothed tension, buying himself a second, maybe two, but time was no longer on his side, because the conversation had already moved forward in a language he could not follow, words flowing again, faster now, more layered, and he could feel the deal drifting further out of reach with every sentence he could not decode. To his right, his chief financial officer adjusted his tie, avoiding eye contact, while the legal advisor flipped a page without reading it, small signs, but clear ones, the kind that only appeared when confidence started to fracture. And Ethan hated that feeling more than failure itself, because failure could be fixed, but loss of control spread, it multiplied, It infected the room. He leaned in again, this time more cautiously, listening for patterns, tone, anything he could anchor to, but all he heard was rhythm without meaning. And across the table, one of the investors spoke directly to him again, this time slower, deliberate. So you are confirming the revised equity condition? And Ethan nodded, because that was what he thought he heard before, because that was what made sense in his mind, because admitting uncertainty was not an option, and yet the second nod landed, heavier than the first, like a signature on a contract he had not fully read. The reaction was immediate, not explosive, but precise, a subtle exchange of looks, a shift in posture, and then the lead investor placed his glass down with quiet finality, not a slam, not even a sound loud enough to draw attention, but enough to mark a turning point. And in that small, controlled movement, the entire direction of the deal tilted away from Ethan without a single raised voice. Naomi saw it happen before anyone acknowledged it. The exact second when confidence left Ethan's shoulders and something else replaced it, something quieter, sharper, more dangerous, because she had seen that look before, not in boardrooms, but in moments when people realized they were standing on ground they did not understand, and she also understood something else, something none of the executives seemed willing to admit, that the conversation they thought they were having was not the one actually taking place. She stepped closer to the table under the pretense of refilling a glass, her movements smooth, practiced, invisible by design, but her attention locked onto the words being spoken, each phrase landing with clarity, each nuance carrying weight, and within seconds, the full picture assembled in her mind, the misalignment, the assumption, the mistake that was about to cost more than money, because this was not just about numbers. This was about trust, and trust, once broken, did not renegotiate. Ethan straightened again, preparing to speak, to salvage, to regain control with sheer presence if nothing else. But before the words could leave his mouth, before the next misstep could seal the outcome, a voice entered the space that no one had expected, calm, measured, and impossibly precise. "Excuse me, sir," Naomi said softly, just enough to be heard, not enough to disrupt, yet somehow enough to stop everything. That is not what they said. The words did not land loudly, but they landed with precision, the kind that did not ask for attention yet commanded it. And for a fraction of a second, no one moved, not because they were told to stop, but because something about the tone made stopping the only natural response. And Ethan turned his head slowly, not out of curiosity, but out of instinct. The instinct of a man who had learned to identify disruption before it became threat, and what he saw was not a strategist, not an executive, not someone seated at the table, but a waitress, standing just within the edge of the conversation, posture straight, expression calm, her presence composed in a way that did not match the role she was supposed to play. The investors noticed it too, not immediately as significance, but as anomaly, a break in pattern, and in rooms like this, pattern was everything, and Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She did not apologize. She did not shrink back. She simply held the moment long enough for it to settle, long enough for everyone to realize she had spoken with intention, not interruption. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recalibration, because there was something in her voice that did not belong to uncertainty. And before he could respond, before anyone could dismiss her presence as a mistake, she continued, her tone still even, still respectful, but now carrying clarity that cut through the confusion that had been building for the last several minutes. "They are not asking you to confirm the revised equity structure," she said, her gaze shifting briefly toward the investors, acknowledging them without overstepping. "They are questioning whether your current terms reflect the valuation adjustment discussed earlier." The difference was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not listening carefully. But in a deal measured in hundreds of millions, subtlety was where everything lived. And for the first time since the conversation had begun slipping, the meaning aligned again. One of the investors leaned forward, interest returning to his posture, and spoke in Mandarin once more, this time watching Naomi instead of Ethan, and she did not hesitate, not even for a second, translating smoothly, accurately, her delivery carrying not just words, but intent, tone, nuance. The things that could not be guessed, only understood, and with each sentence she bridged, the room began to recalibrate around her, Not dramatically, not with applause or recognition, but with something more powerful, attention. Ethan listened, really listened now, not just to the translation, but to the shift itself, the way tension eased without fully disappearing, the way the conversation regained structure, and for the first time that night, he was no longer reacting blindly. He was responding with clarity, guided by a voice he had not even acknowledged minutes earlier. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, never taking a seat, never inserting herself beyond what was necessary, but remaining present, steady, and when she translated again, this time a longer explanation regarding timelines and compliance expectations, there was no hesitation, no searching for words, only precision, and the investors responded accordingly, their tone softening, their posture opening, the negotiation finding its rhythm again as if it had never faltered. No one asked who she was, not yet, because in that moment, identity mattered less than impact, and her impact was undeniable, reshaping the trajectory of a deal that had been seconds away from quiet collapse, not through force, not through authority, but through understanding. And as Ethan leaned back slightly, recalculating, regaining his footing, he realized something that did not sit easily with him, something that did not fit into the structure he trusted. That control had not returned. Because of his power, but because of hers. The room did not return to what it was before. It evolved into something quieter, sharper, more aware, as if every person at that table had just witnessed a shift they could not fully explain, but could not ignore either. And Ethan felt it in the way the investors now looked at him, not with doubt anymore, but with measured curiosity, as though recalculating his position in real time. And for a man who built his entire identity on control, that recalibration was both a relief and a warning. Naomi did not step forward again. She did not claim space. She simply remained where she was, just close enough to be heard when needed, just far enough to never appear intrusive, her hands steady as she adjusted a glass that did not need adjusting, her presence returning to the edges even as her influence remained at the center. The lead investor spoke again, longer this time, his tone deliberate, layered with implications that stretched beyond simple numbers, and Naomi translated without interruption, her voice matching his cadence, carrying not just the meaning but the intention behind every phrase. And as she spoke, the structure of the deal began to rebuild itself piece by piece, terms clarified, expectations aligned, misunderstandings quietly corrected before they could take root again. Ethan leaned forward, but this time there was no forced confidence, no rushed agreement, only precision, each response shaped by clarity instead of assumption, and the difference was immediate. The conversation no longer slipping but moving with purpose, like a machine recalibrated to exact specifications. One of the junior investors exchanged a brief glance with another, a subtle nod passing between them, and while no one announced it, the tension that had once threatened to fracture the deal began to dissolve, replaced by something far more valuable, trust being rebuilt in real time. Naomi caught a phrase mid-sentence, something technical, something buried in regulatory language that most would have overlooked, and she adjusted her translation slightly, refining it, ensuring nothing was lost in interpretation, and the lead investor's eyes flickered for a moment, not in surprise, but in recognition, the kind that acknowledged expertise without needing to name it. Ethan noticed that too, not just the words, but the reactions to them, the way the room responded to her accuracy, her calm, her control, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to follow rather than lead, to listen fully instead of anticipating, and in doing so, he regained something far more stable than dominance. He regained direction. Minutes passed, though they felt different now, no longer stretched thin by uncertainty, but moving with a steady rhythm, and when the final terms were spoken, when the last clarification was translated with quiet certainty, the lead investor placed his glass down once more, but this time the gesture carried a different weight, not finality, but conclusion, and he extended his hand across the table, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the calm assurance of someone who had reached a decision. Ethan met the gesture without hesitation, his grip firm, his expression composed, but inside, something had shifted, something that did not show in posture or tone, something deeper, because he knew, without needing it to be said, that this outcome had not been secured by his usual instincts, not by strategy alone, but by a voice he had not even considered part of the equation. Around them, the room exhaled quietly, conversations resuming in softer tones, glasses lifted once more, the city lights still glowing beyond the glass walls as if nothing had changed, but everything had. And as Naomi stepped back fully into the background, returning to the role the room expected her to play, the only difference was that now, whether anyone said it out loud or not, she was no longer invisible. The handshake ended, but the impact of it lingered far longer than the contact itself, settling into the space like a quiet acknowledgement that something significant had just taken place. And as the investors began to gather their documents and exchange low, satisfied remarks, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, his gaze not on the skyline, not on his team, but somewhere just past the surface of the evening, replaying the exact sequence that had brought them from the edge of failure back to control. He had closed deals before, dozens of them, each one a calculated performance of confidence, pressure, and timing. But this one felt different, not because of the numbers, but because of the gap he had nearly fallen into without realizing it. A gap not in strategy, but in awareness, and that realization did not sit comfortably with him. Around him, his chief financial officer finally exhaled, loosening his tie just slightly, the legal advisor now flipping through pages with purpose instead of distraction, their composure returning in pieces, but neither of them spoke about what had actually happened, not directly, as if naming it would make it more real than they were ready to admit. Ethan stood, adjusting his jacket with the same precision he always did, but the motion carried a different weight now, less about appearance and more about grounding, and as he turned, his eyes found her again, not because she had moved, but because now he was looking for her. Naomi was already stepping away from the table, her role complete in the eyes of everyone except the one person who now understood it had been anything but ordinary, her posture unchanged, her pace steady, as if she had simply done what was required and nothing more. But Ethan knew better, because without her, there would be no handshake, no agreement, no recovery. "Wait," he said, the word leaving his mouth before he had fully decided to speak, and it was not loud, not commanding, but it carried enough presence to pause her just long enough for the moment to form. She turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him, her expression neutral, professional, the same expression she had held all night, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan found himself choosing his words carefully, not because he lacked confidence, but because he understood that this moment was not one he could control with tone alone. "You understood everything they said," he stated, not as a question, but as a realization spoken out loud, and Naomi nodded once, a small, composed motion that confirmed more than it explained. There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, the kind that allowed truth to settle without being rushed, and Ethan took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly, not to conceal, but to focus. "Why are you working here?" he asked, the question simple on the surface, but carrying layers beneath it, layers about opportunity, about visibility, about how someone with that level of precision could exist unnoticed in a room designed to recognize value. Naomi met his gaze evenly, not defiant, not submissive, just steady, and for a moment, it seemed like she might not answer at all, but then she did, her voice quiet, clear, because this is where people like you never think to look, and the words did not accuse, they did not challenge, they simply revealed, and in that revelation, Ethan felt something shift again, not in the room this time, but within himself, because for all the power he had built, all the control he had mastered, there was still something he had overlooked, not once, but repeatedly, and tonight, it had almost cost him everything. The words did not echo, they settled, quiet but undeniable, and Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he lacked something to say, but because for the first time that night, he was not trying to win the moment, he was trying to understand it, and that was unfamiliar territory for a man who built his reputation on certainty. Around them, the room continued to move, servers passing by, glasses being cleared, conversations resuming in low, controlled tones, but for Ethan, everything narrowed to the space between him and Naomi, to the simple truth she had just placed in front of him without decoration or apology. He glanced briefly toward his team, who were now engaged in post-deal logistics, their attention already shifting toward numbers, timelines, execution, as if the most important part of the night had been the signature rather than the near collapse that came before it. And that contrast made something else clear. The system he trusted did not account for what had just happened, because it was never designed to. He looked back at Naomi, studying her more closely now, not her uniform, not her role, but the way she carried herself, the stillness in her posture, the precision in her words, the absence of any need to prove what she already knew. And it did not align with the assumptions he had made within seconds of seeing her earlier that night. "You saved that deal," he said finally, not as praise, not as exaggeration, but as fact, and Naomi did not react the way most people would. There was no smile, no shift in tone, only a small pause before she answered. "I corrected it," she said, her voice even, and the distinction mattered, because she was not claiming ownership of the outcome. She was defining her role in it with accuracy, and that level of clarity was something Ethan recognized immediately, because it mirrored the way he used to think before success made things louder, faster, less precise. He nodded once, absorbing that, then asked the question that had already begun forming the moment she spoke earlier. "Where did you learn to do that?" And again, it was not curiosity for conversation, it was curiosity for context, because what she had demonstrated was not casual knowledge, it was discipline, training, experience layered over time. Naomi glanced briefly toward the table, ensuring her absence was not disrupting service, then back at him, her answer coming without hesitation. "Georgetown," she said, and for a moment, Ethan thought he had misheard, not because the word was unclear, but because it did not fit the narrative his mind had already constructed. "I studied international business and linguistics," she continued, filling the silence before it could turn into doubt. "Mandarin, Japanese, and contract negotiation." The information landed clean, precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and Ethan felt something shift again, not shock this time, but recognition, the kind that came when reality corrected assumption in a way that could not be ignored. "Then why are you here?" he asked, the question quieter now, less about confusion and more about the gap between what should have been and what was. And Naomi held his gaze for a second longer before answering, not with frustration, not with resentment, but with the same calm truth she had carried all night. "Because qualifications do not always decide where you end up," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, only acceptance shaped by experience, and that made it heavier, not lighter. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recalibration, because the equation he had trusted for years had just revealed a variable he had not accounted for. And as he stood there, in a room that still carried his name, his deal, his success, he understood something that did not come with numbers or contracts, that the most valuable asset in that room had never been listed on any sheet, and he had almost let it walk past him without ever seeing it. The air between them held steady, not tense, not relaxed, but charged with something quieter, something more deliberate, and Ethan did not look away this time, because walking away would have been easier, safer, more consistent with the version of himself he had built over the years. But something in him resisted that instinct, something that had been sharpened, not weakened, by what had just happened. He glanced once more toward the table, now half cleared, contracts being folded, assistants already coordinating next steps, the machinery of success moving forward as if it had always been inevitable. And yet he knew better, because just minutes ago, that same machinery had been seconds from failure, not because of a lack of intelligence in the room, but because the right intelligence had been standing just outside of it. "You said Georgetown," he repeated, not to confirm, but to anchor the reality of it, as if saying it again would make it align with what he was seeing. And Naomi nodded once, her posture unchanged, her presence still composed in that same quiet confidence that did not demand recognition, yet could not be ignored once seen. "Top of my class," she added, not with pride, not with emphasis, just as a continuation of fact, and Ethan let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, not out of humor, but out of disbelief at how close he had come to missing something so obvious in hindsight and so invisible in the moment. "And no one picked you up," he said, more to himself than to her, and Naomi gave a slight tilt of her head, not correcting him, not agreeing, just allowing the statement to exist without decoration, because the answer was already clear. For a moment, Ethan said nothing, and in that silence, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the deal, but in the way he was choosing to respond to what he now understood, because for the first time, this was not about leverage, not about control, not about closing. It was about recognition, and recognition required a different kind of decision. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulling out a card, simple, understated, but carrying the weight of everything he had built, and he held it out, not forcefully, not as an order, but as an offering. "Come see me tomorrow," he said, his voice steady, direct. 9 a.m., my office. And there was no pitch in it, no elaboration, no attempt to convince, because the invitation itself was the statement. Naomi looked at the card for a second, not reaching for it immediately, her eyes flicking briefly from the card back to him, measuring not the opportunity, but the intention behind it, and that pause was subtle, but it mattered, because it showed she was not reacting, she was deciding. Around them, no one interrupted, no one questioned, because no one else fully understood the exchange taking place, but Ethan did, and he did not rush her, he did not fill the silence, he simply held the moment long enough for it to be real. Finally, Naomi reached out, taking the card with the same steady hand she had used all night, her expression unchanged, but her voice, when she spoke, carried something slightly different now, not hesitation, not excitement, but clarity. "I will think about it," she said, and the words were simple, but they landed with more weight than agreement ever could, because they shifted the balance once more, placing the decision not in his hands, but in hers. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without resistance, and as she stepped back again, returning to her role, blending once more into the movement of the room, he realized something that no contract could define. That power was not just the ability to command a room, it was the ability to recognize when you no longer should, and for the first time that night, he did not try to take the lead. He let the moment stand exactly as it was, because this time, control was not what mattered. The night did not end when the deal was signed. It lingered, stretching into something quieter, something more reflective, and as the last of the investors exited the rooftop dining room, their voices fading into the polished corridors below, the energy that once filled the space settled into a calm that revealed what had been hidden beneath it all along. Ethan remained for a moment near the window, the city still glowing beneath him, each light representing movement, ambition, decisions being made in rooms just like this one. And yet his focus was no longer on the skyline. It was on the absence left behind, the space Naomi had occupied without ever claiming it. He replayed her words again, not the translation, not the technical precision, but the sentence that lingered the most, because this is where people like you never think to look, and it was not just a statement, it was a mirror, one that reflected something he had not questioned in years. Across the room, the staff moved efficiently, clearing plates, resetting tables, restoring order as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and Naomi was among them again, her presence blending seamlessly into the rhythm of service, her movements just as measured, just as quiet, but now, to Ethan, impossible to overlook. She did not check the card again. She did not linger on the moment they shared. She simply continued working, as if the decision she had been offered was not urgent, not pressing, but something that would be considered on her own terms, and that, more than anything, held his attention. Most people would have seen the opportunity and reacted instantly, eager, grateful, ready to step into a different life without hesitation. But Naomi did not move like that. She moved like someone who understood value, not just the value of the offer, but the value of herself within it. Ethan finally turned away from the window, his reflection fading into the glass as he walked back toward the center of the room, where his team was now gathering their materials, already speaking in forward language, projections, integration timelines, expansion strategies, all the things that followed success. And yet he did not join their conversation immediately, because for the first time, success did not feel complete, not unfinished, but redefined. "Car is ready, sir," his assistant said quietly, stepping into place beside him, and Ethan nodded, but did not move right away, his eyes scanning the room one last time, not for confirmation, not for validation, but for understanding, And when his gaze landed on Naomi again, just for a second, there was no exchange, no acknowledgement, just a quiet recognition that something had shifted in a way that would not reverse itself overnight. Outside, the night air was cooler, the city louder at street level, the contrast between the controlled environment of the rooftop and the movement below almost jarring. And as Ethan stepped into the back seat of his car, the door closing with a soft, final sound, he leaned back, not in relaxation, but in thought, because the question was no longer whether she would come to his office in the morning. The question was whether he had truly earned the right to offer her that choice in the first place. And as the car pulled away, merging into the flow of traffic, one thing was certain: the deal had been secured, but the lesson had only just begun. The next morning did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with clarity, the kind that settles in slowly, like light stretching across a city that never truly sleeps. And by 8:57 a.m., the glass doors of Caldwell Tower reflected a different kind of movement, one built on precision, expectation, and routine. The kind of environment where every second had a purpose and every person had already decided who they were before stepping inside. Ethan stood in his office, not seated behind his desk, but near the window, the same posture he had held the night before, except now the skyline was sharper, colder, stripped of the illusion that came with candlelight and distance, and his reflection in the glass looked exactly the same: tailored suit, controlled expression, the image of a man who had everything exactly where it belonged, except now he knew that was not entirely true. At 9 o'clock exactly, there was a soft knock, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, and for a brief moment, Ethan did not respond, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that whatever happened next would not follow the patterns he was used to controlling. "Come in," he said finally, his voice steady, and the door opened without drama, without hesitation, revealing Naomi standing just inside the threshold, dressed differently now, not in uniform, but in something simple, clean, intentional, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention but did not disappear within a room either. She stepped forward calmly, closing the door behind her, and for a second, neither of them spoke, not out of awkwardness, but because the moment did not require it, the silence carrying more weight than introduction ever could. Ethan gestured toward the chair across from his desk, but Naomi did not sit immediately, her eyes taking in the space, not impressed, not intimidated, just observing, the same way she had the night before, and then, without asking, she took the seat, not as a guest, but as someone who understood she belonged in the conversation. "You came," Ethan said, not as surprise, but as acknowledgement, and Naomi nodded once, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly. "I said I would think about it," she replied, her tone unchanged, "and I did." Ethan studied her for a moment, not evaluating, not measuring, just recognizing. And then he spoke again, more directly this time. "I am not offering you a job because you saved a deal," he said, his voice even. "I am offering because you should have never been outside that room in the first place." And the words did not sound like charity. They sounded like correction, like something being put back where it always belonged. Naomi held his gaze, her expression steady, and then she asked the question that mattered more than the offer itself. "And what happens when I walk into that room again?" she said quietly. "Do I get seen? Or do I have to prove myself all over again?" And the question did not challenge him. It defined the terms, and for a moment, Ethan did not answer immediately, because this was not about confidence. It was about truth, and truth required precision. He stepped away from the window, closing the distance between them slightly, not to assert control, but to remove it. "If you have to prove it again," he said, "then I have not done my job." And the words landed without decoration, without promise, just clarity. Naomi considered that, not quickly, not emotionally, but with the same measured thought she had applied to every moment before this one. And then she nodded once, not dramatically, not with relief, but with decision, the kind that does not need validation. Outside the office, the building continued as it always did, meetings starting, calls connecting, numbers moving across screens, but inside that room, something had already shifted beyond business, beyond titles, beyond the structure that had defined both of them until now, because the deal had been signed the night before, but this This was something else entirely, something quieter, something lasting, and as Ethan extended his hand, not as a transaction, but as recognition, Naomi met it. Without hesitation, not because she needed the opportunity, but because she chose it, and in that choice, the balance of power did not return to what it was before. It became something new, something earned, something understood, because he had the building, he had the title, he had the power, but in that moment, she had something far greater, she had the decision.